Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Nicole O'Mara, and I'm a lead technical writer at Goldman Sachs. For the last 10 years, I've worked various roles in tech, and documentation has been part of all of them. Today, I'm going to talk to you about DocOps, which is also known as documentation operations, and how you can create better documentation with the tools that you're already using. So here's a general overview of what I'll be talking about today. What life was like before DocOps, the debate about whether docs should be treated as part of the project or as their own project, what DocOps is, how to implement it, and some best practices. There will be time for questions and answers at the end, but the moderator will also be asking me the questions that you put in Slido or Slack throughout the presentation. So, before DocOps, let's dive right in. I would tell you to raise your hand if you've encountered any of these, but since our format today is a little bit different, I'm going to talk to you about some problems I've seen industry-wide, and I'm guessing that some of them will resonate with you. Life before DocOps means dealing with a lot of problems, including no centralized location or standardized format for developer docs. Docs typically have way too much content or none at all. End users can't find what they need because documentation is scattered between multiple platforms without a unified search. There are never enough writers. Docs are created reactively to address a problem rather than proactively to accompany release cycles. And developer docs are almost always out of date as a result of continuous release cycles. So what if I told you that there's a better way to handle documentation? And as a developer, you're already using most of the tools necessary to do so. Docs can be treated like code. Developers and product managers can write docs. Docs can be tied to your release cycles. End users can find the docs that they're looking for and self-serve the information that they need. And you can revolutionize the way that your company handles developer docs and reduce drift at the same time. So let's talk about the big debate. Where should developer docs live? There are two schools of thought here, that docs should be part of the project or docs should be their own project. Let's talk about each one. So your first option is to treat docs as part of your project. And when you're doing this, you're storing them in the docs folder inside of your application source repo. From there, you can build your guides and tutorials from the docs folder, and then any reference materials, such as API specs, can be built from code comments in the source folder. There are some major advantages to doing this. Documentation and application source remains in lockstep, and developers are more likely to contribute to documentation since the doc files are in the same environment as their code. Additionally, documentation is tied to the product team's release cycles, which means that your product team can't release a new version until the docs are updated. On the other side of the debate, you can treat docs as their own separate project, independent from source code. So in this case, you'd be building two separate repos. Your documentation comes from the documentation repo, so your guides and tutorials come from there. And then your reference materials still come from the code comments in the source repo. One advantage of this is that documentation for platforms is easier to handle, and releases to guides and tutorials can happen independently of product releases. However, developers are way less likely to contribute because their documentation resides somewhere other than where their source code is. And when your docs folder is in a completely separate place, you end up with a higher risk of documentation drift. Documentation drift is a tech writer's nightmare, and it takes place when code releases are pushed without updating the docs. Have you ever had to Google something because the docs are totally out of date? You've experienced documentation drift. So now I'm going to talk about DocOps and how we've taken lessons from DevOps and are translating them to documentation. So what is DocOps? DocOps enables teams to create and maintain documentation using the same principles as DevOps. Content creation is no longer siloed to technical writers, and release cycles are dependent on docs. So within DocOps, we follow a docs as code model and make use of familiar development tools and techniques. So Markdown for content, Git for version control, CI/CD pipelines, OpenAPI specs for REST APIs, and our code reviews include documentation review. The advantage to this is that instead of having technical writers on every team, we're able to have a centralized documentation team that provides expertise and guidance to our developers and our SMEs. They're available for one-off questions or longer engagements to get a doc site up and running. So why should we change the way that we've been handling documentation? Because with DocOps, as a developer, I'm making my documentation changes inside the same commit as my source code changes. Similarly, as a code reviewer, I'm making sure that the docs are updated when I'm reviewing code. So DocOps allows companies to expand documentation at scale because while everyone wants a technical writer, not everybody wants to pay for one. So when you implement DocOps, you set up tools and frameworks to automate much of the documentation process. And some of these tools include templates, standards to write to, and linters, which allows everyone to write instead of just writers. And that way everyone can stay within the style standards that have already been set for your docs. So once you make the change to DocOps, it's time to start treating your docs as code. Documentation source files sit in the same repo as your application source code. So that was option A from earlier. Developers, project managers, product managers, and technical communicators work together to make sure that documentation is maintained in lockstep with your software releases. And we do this by automating how reference documentation is generated through industry standard tooling, streamlining as much handwritten content as possible, and then all of the content is tested and validated as part of the CI/CD pipeline. So this is something that you do normally when you're writing code, and now we're doing it while we're writing documentation. So let's talk about how DocOps works with different standards and how to implement it. How do we make this work? DocOps requires a pretty basic recipe. For your ingredients, you're going to pick a markup language, a folder structure, and then choose a template type that works for your scenario. You'll need a CI/CD pipeline and a portal. Implement them with your DevOps team, streamline documentation at scale, and profit. Okay, so it might not be that easy, but now I'm going to talk about the different ingredients that make this work. So let's talk about doc formats. For written guides, including developer guides, tutorials, release notes, you'll want to use a markup language such as Markdown, ASCII doc, or another markup language of your choice. Why? There's a low barrier to entry with different markup languages. You can see in this table the difference between Markdown syntax, the HTML that it creates, and how it looks in a browser. It's super easy to create a bulleted list without having to know anything different. And then for reference content, you're going to use industry standard tooling. And what I mean by that is that for REST APIs, you're going to follow OpenAPI specifications. For Java, you'll follow JavaDoc. Scala, you'll follow ScalaDoc. And Python, you would use Sphinx. So on to folder structure. Keep it simple. Docs belong in a docs folder inside your application repo. Why? Because when they're in the same place, you're more likely to update them at the same time. Now, over to the right, I've got an example repo structure for MKDocs. You can see that the docs folder is sitting inside the same repo as the source files, which makes it easy to update both of them at the same time in the same commit. That's the whole point. You want to make this easy. Templates. Why should you use them? Well, most developers aren't writers, which means when they look at a blank page, nothing happens. Templates give you a standard format to write in, which helps give your doc site a consistent look and feel. Plus, they take less time to train to because you can have notes on how to use your templates inside of your templates. So there are some different template types that we employ, and when you switch to DocOps, you can use some of these, all of these, or more. It just depends on what you're looking to create documentation for. Over to the right, you can see an example task template, as well as the helper notes that are inside of it. So when a developer is filling this out, they would basically take guidance from the green notes as to what needs to be filled in, remove the things that they don't need, and then they would create a merge request or PR and merge this to master at the same time that they're merging their code commits. Now with DocOps, your CI/CD pipeline can take over much of the automation for docs. By using linters, your spelling, grammar, and style standards are easily enforced, and your authors can get immediate feedback on the quality of their docs. Now, the cool thing about this is that if you make style changes to your documentation later down the road, you can update your linters to match those style changes. After a successful trip through the pipeline, documentation changes are automatically deployed to the downstream portal. And if you have updated your linters to match your new style changes, your authors will be notified that they need to make changes to their documentation in order to fit the new style. Okay, so the portal or the website that your documentation is being hosted on is where it all comes together. I recommend using a static site generator such as Gatsby, Hugo, or Jekyll to read your repos and build the documentation. As a bonus, when you're using a static site generator, you can easily update your table of contents and your navigation without having to restructure your entire site. You make changes to your config file and they show up everywhere. Now, when you're using a static site generator, your product teams still own their docs inside of their repo, but your end users can find any of the docs that they need on the docs website. Now, what this means is that if you have multiple products within your company, you've got multiple different repos where things are being stored, and then your end users are going to come to one website, search for the documentation that they're looking for, and find it all in the same place. So findability creates usability, and usability creates product transparency. So here are some ways to recognize success when you've moved to a DocOps model. Developers are writing docs while their code is still fresh. Your documentation is updated with each release. It's current and accessible to end users. And your end users are efficient and happy because they can self-service the information that they need without having to contact support because you've updated your documentation. So now I'm just going to talk about a couple of best practices. So some things to keep in mind. It's way easier to figure out what your dev group is doing and base your DocOps standards off of that than it is to build from the ground up. So don't be afraid to ask the developers that you're working with how you can implement a DocOps portal with all of the other standards that are already in place with DevOps. And then the other part of this is just start small. Rome wasn't built in a day. You may have hundreds of products that you need to document, or you may have 10 products that you need to document. Either way, you want to start with one or two after you've built your standards, your templates, and your style guides. And then you can work individually with different developers and content creators to make sure that you're producing the best documentation site possible. Does anybody have any questions?
No questions so far, so you're good to go on.
Okay. That's the end of my presentation. So I'm just gonna end it for here. I will be available in the number 4 Slack room if anybody has anything that comes up. But otherwise, it's been a pleasure speaking for you guys and have a great day.
As a reminder, if you do have questions, you can submit them through Slido on the right-hand side of your page. I'll be able to see them and relay them back to Nicole. So yeah, for the rest of the hour, if you do have questions, you can stop by in there and Nicole will be able to answer them for you.
Yep.
All right.
And there's also a hallway chat as well as room 6 that you can head to if you want to see what other people are working on right now.
All right, and we actually do have a first question here. So question reads, any suggestions on how to address skew when it occurs?
So by skew, what do you mean is really my follow-up to that.
All right, our anonymous questioner, can you add a little bit more detail there? All right, while we're waiting for additional information, there's another question in from Rose who said, this is great. Are there any resources you can point us to for more info, books or repos?
Yeah, there's some really good information on treating docs as code. There's a couple of different books that are available. If you check out the Write the Docs website, you can find them there. And then for repos, when it comes to how to set up the different portals and stuff like that, most of them are open source, so they're available via GitHub. So if you just search for Jekyll or Hugo or um, Gatsby, you can find them available online, and the documentation is pretty decent for them because it's geared towards documentation.
All right, and our anonymous questioner has added some additional details. So in reference to skew, they're asking about the drift between the product release and docs.
Okay, so the main way that we handle that is just by making sure that your releases are tied to your documentation. So instead of saying, hey, I'm going to release this code, you have to make sure that your documentation is up to date. And that's a collaborative project. It's not just something that your developers need to be taking a look at, but also your product managers. And if you're working with a centralized doc team, you can also work with them to make sure that, hey, things are being taken care of. One way that we handle it is basically just by having automated system checks. So every 3 months or so, we send out reminders to the product owners saying, hey, check over your documentation, make sure that everything is correct. And by having that trigger, they're able to go ahead and update the documentation as needed. And that way we can make sure that the docs are staying fresh.
Fabulous. Okay, a couple other questions. From Ryan, how do the requirements for the documentation flow into the development and delivery process?
So with that, it's a little bit of a manual process some of the time. You're going to have a product manager or somebody who's in charge of the product that's going to be making sure that your documentation is being updated. But also when you've got your release checklists and you're making sure that you've got everything ready to go before you push to production, your documentation needs to be part of that release checklist, and it can't be an optional part. It needs to be a required part.
All right, thanks. Another question from Rochelle. Oh, excuse me, sorry, from Jared. When working with a team that everyone has varying opinions on how to or how not to document, how do you best go about getting a standard started for the team?
So there's a couple of ways that you can handle that. If you have a centralized documentation team, they're typically the ones that set the standards, and they will work with the individual teams if new or more templates need to be added, or if there are parts of the style guide that aren't addressing what they want to take care of. Now, when you just have like one individual team that's working on documentation, I typically would suggest not having the entire team work on your style guide, but have a couple of people that are really passionate about it work together so that they can create a style guide that the entire team is going to adhere to. It's the same as if you've got somebody who's really good at working in Python, you're not going to have them working in C sharp because they feel like it today. You're going to have them stay in Python because they're really passionate about it. So if you've got somebody who's passionate about documentation and the different standards that should be set, that's the type of person that you want helping set those standards.
All right, and now a question from Rochelle. She says, I haven't seen an SSG before. Could you demo how that works?
So I don't have a demo that I can easily pull up, but basically an SSG is similar to a content management system, except for it builds your documentation off of Markdown files or ASCII doc files. And when it does that, it automatically has everything stored the way that it's supposed to be, and it's very quick to load. If you check out the different SSGs that I mentioned, so Hugo, Craftsby, Jekyll, all of them are actually built, like their demo websites are built on those SSGs, and it's a really easy way to see how everything comes together.
All right, another question from Jake. He says, how did you develop your documentation templates? Were they sourced externally or developed in-house?
We developed them in-house. I've worked in documentation for years, as have my coworkers, and we iterated on them multiple times to figure out what was going to be the best way to have the templates be easy to use. So previously I'd worked at GoDaddy, so a lot of the articles and topics that I was writing were very task-based. So I took on that and then we iterated on it from there. I have other coworkers that have worked extensively on concept type articles and stuff like that. So we each split it up, and then through the Docs as code process, I lost the headphone. Through the Docs as code process, we basically, pushed things to PRs and then did the review the way that we were supposed to. And then once we agreed on it, it was pushed over to master and then available for other people to use within the firm.
Okay, do we have any other final questions? We've obviously got some time, so if that's the case, continue to put them into Slido. Okay, it doesn't look like we've got any questions coming in just yet. But Nicole, I think you mentioned you'd be here through the rest of the hour, so.
Yep, I'll be in the Slack room, so I'll answer any questions that you have there.
Okay, sounds great.
Great, have a good one.